While I was on vacation last week, I watched Pastor Brian preach his sermon online on Abraham and Sarah. There's another reason why I'm thankful for technology, and I know a lot of people who are tuning in and tune in every week would say the same thing. And so if you were either here or watching online, you might remember that he started off his sermon last week by telling a story about something that happened here just a week or so before that. On that particular Sunday, when we came in, we usually get here around 8 o'clock or a little before, Brian went and he turned on all the projectors, and the projector that points towards the back of the back screen, instead of the nice clear picture that we normally get, there was a message that read, "This projector bulb has reached the end of its useful life." Not a message that you want to see on a Sunday morning at all. And so as he was telling that story, just for a little bit, I was concerned that he might be preparing to say something about me. Just a minute. But of course, that wasn't what he was doing at all. The point of his story was that even though at 75 years of age, Abraham and Sarah were getting close to the end of their lives, their useful lives, they still chose to step out in faith and do something new. And as a result, the whole world was blessed. Even then, they stepped out in faith. Now, I've often wondered when I read that story what Abraham and Sarah's friends and family thought when they announced suddenly that they were going to set out on this journey, right? As we've been exploring over the past 3 weeks now, what they did represented the very definition of living dangerously. Abraham and Sarah chose to follow God. They chose faith and the uncertainty that automatically comes with faith. We talked about that the very first week when we talked about the Hebrews 11 definition of faith as you know, it's not based on certainty. It's the promise of things hoped for, the things unseen, right? They chose faith and the uncertainty that automatically comes with it instead of the more concrete certainty of a pension and a rocking chair. We know from reading the rest of the Old Testament that Abraham and Sarah's descendants also chose that same path. They chose to trust God even when it was dangerous to do so. Sometimes that meant answering God's call to get up and go. And sometimes, as we explored during our last sermon series, it meant blooming right where they were planted. Back in April, we explored one really good example of that last one, of blooming where you're planted, which happened during the Babylonian exile of Israel. God spoke through the prophet Jeremiah and counseled Abraham's descendants, the people of Israel, to seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. In other words, Jeremiah was telling the people of Israel they didn't have to be angry all the time because the people around them didn't share their faith and beliefs. But at the same time, they also didn't have to be assimilated. They didn't have to become like every other Babylonian. They could have children and plant gardens and live productive lives. In fact, as we read in Jeremiah, God wanted them to pray for the welfare of the very nation that had destroyed their temple and taken them into captivity. That's what he was telling them to do. So sometimes living dangerously means getting up and going somewhere new. I think more often than not, it means living dangerously means figuring out how to live faithfully right where you are, even when there are powerful forces working against that. So here's the truth as I see it. Living as people of faith in the midst of a fallen and broken world, okay, no matter where you go, even if you get up and go, it's a fallen and a broken world, it will always be a challenge. There will always be a temptation to either bitterness and anger, right? And the violence that often comes with that, or assimilation. In other words, we either feel like we have to fight or fall into line, as if those were the only two choices. As I was making notes for my sermon this week, I wrote down a sentence. I wrote down the words, "Let me address the elephant in the room." And then I crossed that out and I wrote, actually, "Let me address the elephant and the donkey in the room." So the idea I was getting at is that in contemporary America, probably really for most of our history, we've always been expected to either join one, right, and fall in line and fight against the other. So we're pressured to assimilate and then basically go to battle. In fact, I think we're all so accustomed to this by now that most of the time when something new, is in the news, we all have a pretty good idea what our team is expected to do and say, what our expected response will be. But sometimes it's not clear. Sometimes we kind of have to wait and see. And then when our team leaders have it figured out, then we are expected to fall in line again. But let me ask you this, and you can sit with this question. I hope you do. Have you ever been even a little bit uncomfortable with your team's response? Have you ever thought, maybe there is another way? Well, I'm here today to tell you there is another way. It is the path that was first charted by Abraham and Sarah. It's the path that was dramatically demonstrated by the people of Israel when they were living in exile in Babylon. Jesus described it as the narrow way. It is the path of faith. The reason it can feel dangerous is because it manages to steer an alternative course to what pretty much everyone else is doing. That's the path of faith. It boldly proclaims that we can live outside of those false divisions and yet still manage to be a channel of blessing and love to everyone. In the Old Testament, Joshua once challenged the people of Israel to recommit themselves to the path of faith that was started with Abraham and Sarah. And you might remember the story. It comes from near the end of his life. They'd been in the promised land for a long time, and they were beginning to become kind of assimilated to the culture in which they'd settled. And so he calls all of Israel together, and he makes a pronouncement. He says, "Choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, beyond the Jordan River." And now he's talking about pre-Abraham, when they served other gods, other religions. Or, he says, the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now dwell. In other words, become assimilated to the culture now in which you now live. And then he finishes with this challenge. He says, "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." I don't know about you, but I feel a little bit like Joshua did. There's only really one team I want to be a part of, and that's Jesus' team. Yes, I'm an American citizen, and I accept all the responsibilities that come with that. I pray for the welfare of the nation where I was born, for my homeland. But first and foremost, I am a child of God and a disciple of Jesus. There's nothing that comes before that for me, no matter what the powers that be might demand. And they will demand. And our fellow team members will also pressure us to fall in line. And sometimes when we fail to be sufficiently compliant, there will be consequences. I don't know if you follow religious news at all, or if you saw anything on this on the news. But just this past week, Reverend Rick Warren, senior pastor at Saddleback Church in California, author of The Purpose-Driven Life, Purpose-Driven Church, probably dozens of other books, he stood up against the entire Southern Baptist denomination, the entire Southern Baptist church, after his church and many other churches were formally disaffiliated because they ordained women pastors. And this is a picture of him at their convention just this past week, standing up for women's pastoral leadership in the church. He stood up, and he and all of those other churches were rejected. They lost the vote. They are no longer Southern Baptist churches. Sometimes the pressure to fall in line is intense, and sometimes resisting it can feel risky. But the good news is that it's often along that dangerous path that we discover the very presence and protection of God. As the psalmist wrote, same idea. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, most dangerous path you can imagine, I fear no evil, for you are with me. He's talking directly to God. He's not doing theology. He's praying, for you are with me. In our scripture reading today, we're going to read about 3 young men who chose that dangerous path of faith. It's a story from the book of Daniel, which was also set against the backdrop of the Babylonian exile, same time period. As you might remember, when Israel was first dominated by Babylon, Daniel and his 3 friends, their names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they were all still teenagers. Of course, those 3 guys are better known by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the name, by the way, everybody gets it wrong. I do too. We say Abednego, but it's actually Abednego. So mark that down in your notes. So these three guys were smart, they were young, they were handsome, and they were chosen to serve in the palace of King Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth. And they were right there, serving him. As Jeremiah had instructed, they were doing everything they could for the welfare of the nation where they were planted. They served on the king's personal staff, but they never forgot who they were. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's first test of faith came when they were asked to eat the same diet as everyone else on Nebuchadnezzar's staff. They wanted to maintain their kosher diet, right? They wanted to maintain their Jewish identity, and they were being forced to eat this very rich, probably very appetizing diet to us, but they couldn't do that. And so they said no, and they worked out a deal. They ate only vegetables, and everybody thought that they would suffer as a result of that, but they didn't. They remained among the most vigorous and healthy of all of Nebuchadnezzar's servants, and they continued to grow in success and in influence. Even with Nebuchadnezzar, they just continued to get promoted. Now, several years later, however, they faced another more serious challenge. This is the story I think most of us know. This time, Nebuchadnezzar built a 90-foot statue of himself out of solid gold. And then he demanded everyone in the empire bow down and worship it. Anyone who didn't would be thrown into a fiery furnace. Once again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had a decision to make. And once again, they chose the more dangerous path, the most dangerous path. They remembered God's commandment about worshiping idols. Actually, the first 2 commandments, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not bow down and worship idols, even if it's a statue of your boss. Now, of course, Nebuchadnezzar was so angered by their disloyalty that he immediately fired up the fiery furnace and had them thrown in. It was so hot, in fact, that the people, the guards that threw them into the fire died. That's how hot this fire was. We pick up the story in Daniel 3, verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire?" They answered the king, "True, O king." He replied, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their tunics were not harmed, and not even the smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any other god except their own God." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. A few weeks ago, I talked about how idolatry, I think, is the first and worst of all of the sins. And what's interesting about idolatry, and I talked about that in that sermon, is the fact that it's usually pretty subtle, so we don't notice it. It doesn't rise to the level of our attention all that much. But for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it wasn't subtle at all. Not at all. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Bow down and worship my golden idol." Doesn't get more concrete than that. And if you do, you can continue to be a part of the team if you fall in line. And if you don't, you're going to die. Now, you might remember, Jesus was given a similar choice right at the beginning of his ministry. When he was out in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, Satan took him up on top of a tall mountain and said, "All of this can be yours. The whole world can be yours. You can rule over it however you want. You can put whatever great laws, you can, all the justice, all the love, all the mercy and compassion, you can do all of that. All you have to do is bow down and worship me first. All you have to do is fall in line. Or you can take the other path, which is the more dangerous path, and we know how that path ended, don't we? It ended with Jesus on the cross. Jesus' response to that temptation, and it was a temptation, right? I get to be in charge of all these people and help them live their best lives. All I have to do is just bow down and worship you. It was a temptation, but his response was the same as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He said simply, "Worship the Lord your God and serve him only, and I'll deal with the consequences." Of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't want to go into a blazing furnace. I don't think anybody would. But it turned out that going faithfully into that furnace was the single most important moment of their lives. The place that seemed like certain death actually wound up being the safest place of all. And afterwards, they thrived like they never had before. This week I read a sermon by John Ortberg called "The Fourth Man in the Furnace." And in that sermon, he imagined that God has a calendar on which he puts reminders. Okay, now put your theological thinking away. We know God knows everything. But in this scenario, God has a calendar. And on that day that those 3 young men were sentenced to death, God had written down, "Meet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace." Okay? Certain time, certain date. And then Ortberg asked the question, what if they hadn't shown up? We certainly wouldn't be talking about them now. And then Ortberg directs a question at his congregation. He directs a question at us, and he says this. He says, if God scheduled a meeting with you in the furnace, would you make it? Or might you bend the knee to the wrong God? Now, I am no fan of the furnace. I like good times as much as anybody else, but I also believe that if my primary goal in life is to avoid the flames or any other kind of discomfort or danger, if that's all I want, if that's my primary goal, then there's a very real possibility that I will miss God entirely. I've been in the furnace before, as I know many of you have. And while that wasn't my goal, I did discover, just like those 3 young men, that God met me there. He never let me go. And afterwards, I'm here to tell you that I thrived in ways that I know wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't taken the path of faith. Never forget, God is with us in the fire. Never forget, God is with us even in the valley of the shadow of death. Remember what Paul said in Romans 8. Who or what shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? He covers all the perils, right? All of the dangers just about. And then he says, no, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor demons, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation, even the hottest furnaces. I added that part in. None of that will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. That is the good news we see in the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it's also the good news of Jesus Christ. Amen.